Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I have always wanted to say that. Hello, my name is Sebastian Lemberger. Before we get to the meat of this talk, I think it might be useful if all of you knew a little bit more about me. I am an 11th grader in high school, and for the past 3 or so years of my life, I've been doing work as a semi-professional legislative climate activist. Now, I love activism, except for one part. Because when you are an activist, you start to develop a complicated relationship with the idea of conformity. Because on one hand, the entire point of activism is to diverge from the status quo and change the system. But on the other hand, it is often the case that the most efficient way to change a system is to reshape it from the inside. And as such, it is often incredibly frustrating to be forced to participate in a system that you morally disagree with. Now, I get into arguments about this with my parents quite a bit, and those arguments are usually about college. A couple months ago, I was doing a presentation on inequality in higher education and how wealth stunts the income distribution of students that are getting into top universities. And this presentation proved to be a little bit contentious with my mother, because as she pointed out, I go to a private prep school, and as such am a conscious part of the problem to which I object, and should thus maybe, tone it down a bit. And when I heard this, I vehemently disagreed with the second part of the argument, why should I tone myself down? But then I heard the first part of the argument. I started to feel a bit guilty. I feel guilty a lot about colleges though, usually the prestigious ones, because I find that there is often a divide between their practices and what I personally believe in, especially when it comes to fossil fuel companies. If you didn't know already, and I assure you by the end of this talk, you will know, the fossil fuel industry has its claws everywhere, even in top research institutions. And as a climate activist, this annoys me to no end. But what's even more annoying, however, is that no matter how much I might find it morally objectionable that these universities are just leaving the door open for fossil fuel companies to come in and tamper with their research, I still desperately want to go to schools that walk hand in hand with oil and gas companies. But before we unpack that, some of you might be a little bit confused as to what the sinister relationship to which I'm referring between universities and fossil fuel companies actually is. And for that reason, I think that a history lesson is in order. Now, it is common knowledge that disinformation and propaganda are an essential part of the fossil fuel industry's strategy of staying afloat in the age of climate change. Chances are you, at some point in your life, have been lied to by a fossil fuel company. Yes, even you. I know I have. When I was in elementary school, a big part of my very, very basic education on climate change involved learning how to reduce my personal carbon footprint. Unfortunately, however, carbon footprint was a term that was coined in 2004 by British Petroleum, of all people, in order to displace blame from climate change from themselves onto individual consumers. And there is a long, long list of similar disinformation tactics that have been historically used by the fossil fuel industry that include, but are not limited to, PSAs about how CO2 emissions are going to make all the plants grow more, and also official ExxonMobil-sponsored Mickey Mouse comic books. Yeah, these are real. But the thing is, in our day and age, a lot of these strategies are actually becoming less and less frequently used. And the reason for that is that because in our day and age, it's actually kind of hard not to believe in climate change. California keeps getting lit on fire, the winters are getting shorter, the Gulf Stream is going away. It's abundantly clear that there is something wrong. And as such, if you are a fossil fuel company seeking to preserve your business model through disinformation, You can't just lie blatantly about climate change anymore. You need a much more subtle touch. In recent years, nearly every major fossil fuel company has in some way acknowledged the existence of climate change. But the strange thing is that instead of supporting the transition to renewable energies, these companies are supporting solutions like natural gas, which they call low carbon, and carbon capture-assisted fossil fuel combustion, which they also call low carbon. And no matter how many times you say low carbon, those billowing clouds of smoke really aren't low carbon. And it is the push for false solutions like these, in addition to lobbying and disinformation and infrastructure work, that is really the fossil fuel industry's last stand before we get hit with the full force of climate change. And the funny part about it all is that a good deal of what these companies are doing is actually not possible with the help of university research. Allow me to explain. Everyone believes a study that comes out of Harvard or MIT, right? It tends to be the case that we believe anything that has to do with our top universities. That's just the nature of prestige. But unfortunately for us and the rest of humanity, really, fossil fuel executives are very aware of this, and they will take advantage of it. We look at ExxonMobil, for instance. Exxon is one of the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world, and is also probably the one that is most frequently associated with disinformation. It drops a cool 50 mil every year on lobbying against climate policy in the US alone. It is also a founding partner of the MIT Energy Initiative and engaged in groundbreaking research with over 80 universities worldwide. Wow, yay Exxon. And the funny thing is that Exxon isn't even alone. Many fossil fuel companies engage in similar research partnerships with energy research centers at various universities. And this practice has been around for a while, but it really came into its own in terms of disinformation in the 90s, when fossil fuel companies started to realize that if they wanted to disinform in relation to climate change, if they start putting their own people in university research centers, those people could publish papers in order to convince the general public that climate change was less of a threat. And today, this practice persists in energy research centers at universities like Columbia, Stanford, and MIT, just to name a few, all of which take fossil fuel money and, according to a study by Nature, show statistically significant favorability towards solutions like natural gas. But this is small peanuts in terms of things that the fossil fuel industry has done in universities to disinform. Let's look at something really serious. In 2015, a Harvard astrophysicist named Dr. Willie Soon was discovered by Greenpeace to have directly received around $1.2 million in funding from various fossil fuel companies over the course of his career. Now, you might be wondering, why are they funding an astrophysicist, of all people? And the answer to that is, in his papers, Willie Soon had been claiming that fluctuations in the energy levels of the sun were the reason why climate change was happening. That's not true, by the way. That's absolutely and unequivocally not true. But the thing is, it doesn't even matter what Soon was trying to claim in his papers, because he was making those claims out of Harvard University. And due to Harvard's credibility, Soon gained credibility in and of himself when publishing, and thus the fossil fuel industry gained credibility as well. I will say, however, in cases such as these, it is very rarely the individual researcher's fault, because academic research is very consistently underfunded. It is often the case that researchers have to take industry funding in order to get their projects off the ground, even when they work for some of the most affluent institutions in the world. And if that is the case, it really lies in the hands of the institutions themselves to protect their researchers from external influence like the fossil fuel industry. And it is this idea of academic freedom, by which I mean the obligation of educational institutions to defend their scholarship from outside influence, that really lies at the heart of what they are supposed to be doing as schools. So as long as universities are just allowing fossil fuel companies to come in and essentially tamper with research agendas, they're fundamentally failing in one of their most basic duties as educational institutions. And thus, as long as we want universities that actually adhere to their principles, we have to purge every single fossil fuel company from every single university campus. Note, however, that I said we and not they, because as nice as it would be if every university administrator across the world just waved their magic wand and made all the fossil fuel companies disappear, that's just not going to happen. And as such, it lies in the hands of students and faculty at these institutions to move their schools forward. Earlier, I spoke about feeling guilty about wanting to attend a school that takes any form of oil and gas money. But the thing is that while feeling guilty isn't actually going to do anything about the problem, getting involved will. As a legislative activist, I am very familiar with the idea that in order to change a system, you do have to interact with it at some point. Indeed, most of the progress that's being made on this issue is being made by students at institutions that take lots and lots of money from the fossil fuel industry. Thanks to the efforts of student activists at universities like Princeton, Cambridge, and VU Amsterdam, all of these schools in recent years have taken steps to distance themselves from fossil fuel companies. If we look at Princeton, for instance, the students there fought for 9 years in order to dissociate their endowment until 2023, when the university finally pledged partial dissociation. And the students involved in this knew that they were participating in a struggle that would vastly exceed the scope of their own personal tenures at the university, but they kept fighting. And in doing so, they got tangible results. And even now, although Princeton has completed divestment of its endowment as of this February, student activists are still moving the university forward on its journey towards separation, because while they do have a dissociation policy, that policy is full of loopholes that allow companies like British Petroleum to continue funding research at the school. So although not all of the policies being put out in relation to this are not perfect, it's encouraging that they still exist, because change is never going to happen unless there are people on the ground fighting for it. If you are in college, or perhaps planning on going to college, I encourage you to look at research centers on the campus of whatever university you are attending or planning on attending, and checking out their papers and websites for any sort of conflict of interest or partnership statement that could tie them to a fossil fuel company. And if you do find that there is a fossil fuel company messing around on your campus, I implore you, do not be idle, because institutions like universities depend on you to be idle in order to go about business as usual. Join an environmental club at your school, or if there is no environmental club, make one yourself. File a complaint to the research centers that are taking the money. And if they don't listen to you, and let's face it, they probably won't, keep going up the chain of command until you find somebody who does. Write an op-ed or a letter to the editor. It doesn't matter where it gets published as long as someone hears what you have to say. No matter what you do, however, as long as you believe that academia and fossil fuels should never cross paths, don't just sit there and feel guilty, because feeling guilty doesn't solve problems. If you, like me, find yourself participating in a system to which you object morally, don't do nothing. Find a way to change it. Thank you.